Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. They call the place Sentinel Joint Operations Base, but to most people who work there it's just the base, a long, humming organism of glass corridors, briefing rooms, and ranks stitched on collars. Riley walks those corridors every morning with a folder under her arm and a head full of numbers. She's not loud about it. She doesn't have to be. Precision shows up in the details, timestamps, checked boxes, an insistence that a schedule actually fits the work it claims to schedule. Early that week the Eastbridge screens glow with logistics charts and movement plans, the coffee machine in the corner sputters as officers filter through the morning. Riley's team is small, tight. Aaron and Sophia joke in low voices near the terminal while Miguel drops by with a dry, practical half-smile and a question about a timeline. The routines make up the heartbeat of their days, until one brief sits in a briefing room and changes the beat. That morning, Benedict Rourke presides over the table like a storm cloud with medals. He speaks in a voice trained to close arguments before they begin, confident, final, practiced. He presents a plan that looks clear on paper, full of dates and unit names, the kind of presentation that fills eyes with assurance. But Riley sees the gap, a 2-day hole where maintenance meets transit, a slot where armored units leave port before inspections finish. She raises her hand, points to a chart, and speaks plainly. It's procedural. It's a safety call. It's a risk flagged. The room shifts. Some faces tighten with relief that someone noticed. Others harden. Rourke's jaw sets, the air moves in a new way now, electric and dangerous. After, the whispering begins. Not all of it is mean, but enough of it carries the scent of consequence. The memo she receives later that day is clinical and cold, a review, a suspension of sorts from sensitive duties. There's procedure in it, words that sound like protection but press like a trap. Riley goes back to her office and starts the work that will become her lifeline, documenting, double-checking, building a timeline that can't be swept away by accusations. Miguel tells her quietly to gather witnesses and keep everything backed up. Aaron looks at his screen, nervy but honest, and Sophia watches, ready to stand if needed. The base hums around them, drills, radios, the endless shuffle of authority, but under the noise there's a tension that didn't exist before, as if someone has nudged a domino and the whole line teeters. At night she writes the first letter she never expected to send. Not emotional, not pleading, just facts, timestamps, and a clear map of what happened. And in the back of her head she thinks of Hawthorne's name, an admiral she met once in a seminar, decisive, fair, the sort of leader who listens when evidence is placed cleanly before her. For now, that is only a thought. For now, Sentinel Base keeps humming, and Riley stays awake with the glow of the laptop, arranging the evidence that will either protect her or become a story of what happens when someone speaks up inside a system that values command above all else, doesn't break easily, and that evidence would soon be tested in ways Riley couldn't fully predict. The next morning the base felt different, not loud, but watchful, like a room waiting for someone to speak. She brought her folder to the morning brief anyway, because work doesn't stop for fear. The Eastbridge screens were up, the planners murmured, Aaron tapped at logs with a nervous rhythm. Riley set her file on the table and met Miguel's eyes. He gave the faint nod that meant, do it right. She did. Rourke was waiting, of course. He had the look of a man who'd rehearsed being offended and perfected it. He read the room like a general reads a map, he knew where to press, which faces to frighten into silence. When he raised the review memo publicly, it landed like a shot across the bow. Procedures, he said. Protocol, he said. The language was formal, but everyone understood the meaning, back off, or be made an example. A few officers shuffled their feet, a couple of old hands glanced at their shoes to avoid choice. Riley kept her voice steady. She pointed out the maintenance overlap again, walked the board through the numbers. Her logic was clear, but the mood had shifted from technical to political. That was when things stopped being only about safety. The retaliation grew subtle at first. Briefings she should have been in were cancelled with scheduling conflicts. Emails went unanswered. Requests for supporting documents were delayed until they were useless. Worse, private comments started to leak, the kind meant to isolate. "She's stirring trouble," someone muttered in a hallway with too many listeners. In the mess hall, conversations fell quiet when she walked by. Even Aaron, who wanted to speak up, flinched when Rourke's aide passed by. Riley kept recording. She printed timestamps, saved backups, archived file versions. Miguel arranged side meetings with two officers who'd been ordered to adjust numbers. They spoke in a cramped office with the window shades drawn. One of them, quiet and near tears, admitted they had been pressured, not overt threats, but career-friendly suggestions: "Adjust this, it'll go smoother." The words were small, but their meaning was lethal in this place. Riley understood that the campaign wasn't just to remove her from a project, it was to make anyone who might question a safer playbook think twice. The implication alone would chill future dissent. As the review board date set, talk of Emily, no, Riley in their circles, became a measured mix of concern and calculation. People she trusted urged caution: "Get everything in a secure place," Miguel said. "Don't let him corner you in private spaces." Captain Sandoval's face went flat when he mentioned Admiral Hawthorne's name. "If you can get the Admiral's attention, do it," he said. There was truth in that. Hawthorne's involvement would change the stakes. The Admiral had authority that crossed branches and could cut through politics. That meant the next move had to be precise, not passionate. Riley drafted the letter she hoped would reach Hawthorne. It was a tight, professional narrative: the who, what, when, where, and why, with attachments, schedules, emails, security footage timestamps. She resisted the urge to make it personal. Emotion could be dismissed. Facts could not. Aaron watched as she formatted the files, his jaw clenched. Sophia stayed with her late to verify logs. They moved like people preparing for something that might save or shatter a career. Still, the pressure intensified. One night, as Riley left the Eastbridge Center, she found a note slipped under her car windshield wiper: "Stay in line." It was anonymous and cowardly, the kind of intimidation that works by feeding fear rather than making threats directly. She photographed it, added it to the file, and carried on. The message only confirmed what she already suspected: this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a campaign. But proof was brittle in a culture that rewarded rank and punished anyone who disturbed the order. The coming weeks would show whether precision and truth could withstand polished authority and the social machinery that covers for it. In the weeks that followed, the base felt smaller and louder at the same time. Every step Riley took seemed to echo a question she couldn't ignore. The review board date moved closer, like a tide marking its approach. Meetings multiplied and every request for clarification felt like a probe. Riley pushed back where she could, but the institution had a way of redirecting energy into paperwork and procedure until momentum died. That was the tactic, she realized: drown the truth in process. So she shifted tactics too. If the system would throw paperwork at her, she would return it, documented and precise, until there was no room left for comfortable ambiguity. Miguel set up a secure folder, copies in 3 places, redundancy like an insurance policy against tampering. Sophia learned how to extract server logs and hide them inside innocuous files. Aaron grew steadier by the hour. The jitter that marked him earlier became a kind of determination. They met after hours in the corner conference room, low voices, the soft glow of monitors the only light. They cross-checked every timestamp, rehearsed testimony lines, and practiced how to present facts without sounding like they were asking for sympathy. The goal was simple and cold: make the record airtight. Outside the office, Rourke's campaign tightened in quieter, more effective ways. He started to reassign projects subtly, placing his most loyal officers in positions where they could control narrative and access. He initiated audits that were thinly veiled attempts to redirect attention from the timeline he had authored. When he did speak in public, it was in tones that suggested concern for order rather than accusation, a tactic to keep plausible deniability on his side. Rumors about Riley's temperament circulated, thin as cigarette smoke but persistent. The trick was to smear without needing direct proof. Suspicion would do the work. Pressure did something else, it revealed people. Some retreated into caution, others stepped up. A mid-level officer who had previously avoided involvement caught Riley after a briefing and handed over an encrypted thumb drive. "Saw something in a spreadsheet," he said, voice low. "Couldn't let it go." That one small risk changed the texture of her file. Another junior NCO came forward with a recorded message from a briefing where instructions had been softened and then subtly altered in the final report. These were not dramatic victories, but incremental ones, the kind that build a case like mortar between bricks. At night, tension bit into Riley's sleep. She dreamed of schedules melting into lists of names, of paths crossing and detours appearing where lanes should be clear. When awake she felt the physical toll, headaches at dawn, the metallic taste of anxiety persistent on her tongue. Yet she also felt a growing clarity. Pressure stripped away convenience and showed what mattered. It honed Riley in ways that compliments never had. She stopped worrying about being liked and focused on being right, accurate, and durable. Then came the first overt pushback. An internal memo surfaced that questioned the integrity of the data sources Riley had used. It arrived framed as due diligence but read as accusation. The tone was clinical, the wording precise enough to sting. Miguel called it a classic preemptive strike, generate doubt about the evidence before the board sees it. So Riley responded by lining up witnesses who could speak to data collection processes, chain of custody, and who had been present when figures were compiled. Each testimony added weight, pushed back against the smear, and forced the conversation back toward verifiable facts. Still, the human cost grew. Some colleagues who had initially supported her subtly distanced themselves when their own promotions or assignments were mentioned in guarded conversations. Loyalty proved expensive in a place where careers moved on thin threads. Riley saw the choices etched on faces: self-preservation, solidarity, cowardice, courage. She carried none of it as drama, it was logistics with faces. The stakes were not abstract. Lives depended on schedules, on vehicles arriving when they were supposed to arrive. That reality steadied her resolve. The review board loomed, but the story had shifted. It was no longer only about one officer's courage. It was about whether a system would protect those who raised alarms or protect those who covered them up, and now the room was set to decide. The Arlington Strategic Review Hall smelled like polished wood and coffee. The semicircle of officers looked like a jury that had been asked to judge not just a person, but a precedent. Riley walked in with the binder she had carried through sleepless nights, timelines, emails, server logs, witness statements, and the small, anonymous threats neatly catalogued. Miguel gave a curt nod from the second row. Aaron and Sophia sat stiff, faces pale but steady. Rourke sat at the center, posture rigid, as if posture alone might steady a collapsing case. The proceedings began with formalities that could have been a lullaby if truth weren't on the line. Rourke presented his narrative with the smoothness of someone used to scripting outcomes. He described procedure, chain of command, concerns for cohesion. He talked about discipline and example, words that sounded responsible until you noticed how they were aimed. He did not need to shout. The architecture of rank amplified a quiet shove into consequences. Riley listened without interruption, letting his statements hang in the air so everyone could see what he was asking them to accept. Then Admiral Hawthorne entered. It was not an entrance so much as a recalibration of the room's gravity. She moved to the front, took no seat, and asked simple questions in a voice that carried no theater, only clarity. "Show me the chain of custody," she said, and pointed to Riley's binder. Riley presented. The Admiral went through the attachments with a precision that felt surgical. When Hawthorne looked up, she addressed the board as if speaking to commanders in a mission brief. We evaluate facts, not rumor. We hold to the record because lives rely on it. Witnesses were called. Miguel spoke first, steady, outlining how data had been compiled and preserved. Aaron described, with a blunt honesty that cut through the softness of politics, the nights they had locked files, the logs he had saved. Sophia delivered technical detail on server timestamps, the kind of minutiae that leaves no room for conjecture. One by one, the board watched the narrative shift from accusation to verification. Pieces Rourke had hoped would remain ambiguous snapped together until his version looked like a patchwork with missing stitches. Then Hawthorne turned to the anomalies. She showed a side-by-side of Rourke's original reports and the final versions filed in multiple places. The changes were small on the surface, dates shifted, language softened, but their pattern was unmistakable. The Admiral's questions were not accusatory, they were methodical. Who ordered these edits? She asked. Silence tightened. Rourke's control dissolved into a sequence of denials and evasions. The board, trained to respect rank, found itself looking at facts that refused to yield to rank. At one point Rourke tried to reframe his actions as oversight, a miscommunication blown up by personality. Hawthorne did not let it stand. She laid out the evidence of coercion, emails suggesting pressure, testimonies of quiet threats, statements from officers who had felt the squeeze of career implications. The more he tried to explain, the more any plausible deniability thinned. The room shifted from curiosity to moral accounting. When the hearing adjourned for deliberation, the tension felt like a held breath. Outside the chamber, whispers had already begun. Inside, the board's decision would not be about Riley alone, it would be about whether the institution would tolerate manipulation of facts for personal advantage. In the corridor afterwards, people who had kept their heads down began to meet eyes with those who had spoken out. The scale of what could happen next was enormous. For Riley, the moment was both terrifying and clarifying. She had pushed a system to reveal itself, and now the consequences would follow not as a whispered threat, but as formal action, and the change came faster than Riley expected. Within 48 hours an administrative order removed Rourke from his direct command responsibilities pending an investigation. It read like a small revolution in bureaucratic language, temporary reassignment, suspension from operational oversight, and a formal inquiry into conduct and record integrity. The headlines inside the base didn't exist, but the effect was the same. People who had been careful about their looks and words now walked with more measured steps, and some faces that had been tight with fear relaxed a fraction. Riley stayed at her desk while others traded guarded congratulations. She felt relief, yes, but it came mixed with a strange fatigue. Vindication had weight. Miguel stopped by, put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and said nothing that could be misread. Gratitude was folded into the quiet protocols of rank. Aaron exhaled like someone who'd been holding his breath for weeks. Sophia's smile was small but real. They had won a formal recognition that their documentation and persistence had been taken seriously, but they had also watched a man lose power, and the moral arithmetic of that was complicated. Admiral Hawthorne's involvement made the difference people had been whispering about. She ordered a parallel administrative review and ensured the chain of custody on evidence was respected. That removed the cheap tricks that could have undone months of work. The hearings that followed were less performative and more procedural. They focused on documents, edits, and the specific moments where intent could be inferred from action. Witnesses were protected, statements were recorded under strict protocols, and the institution moved to correct the record. Publicly the base emphasized process, fairness, impartiality, and due diligence. Privately, conversations shifted from "what if" to "how do we repair?" Riley took this seriously. She didn't want revenge, she wanted systems fixed so the next person wouldn't have to fight as she had. She pushed for clearer documentation protocols, redundant verification steps, and a protected channel for reporting anomalies without immediate exposure to chain-of-command reprisals. It was practical, not ideological. She knew reforms had to be implementable, not slogans. Some resisted. People who had benefited from the old opacity argued about bureaucracy and efficiency, claiming extra checks would slow operations. Riley listened, negotiated, and insisted on pilots rather than mandates, small changes that could prove their value in days rather than in policy cycles. Miguel leveraged his credibility to smooth conversations. Aaron and Sophia helped map the technical processes that made redaction or alteration difficult to hide. The improvements were incremental, and that was the point: make it harder to break trust, not impossible to function. Meanwhile, Rourke's reassignment became official, and the inquiry pronounced faults in his administration, mishandled records, inappropriate pressure on subordinates, and edits that had no operational justification. He was not arrested or publicly disgraced in a tabloid way. He was stripped of authority and moved into a role that limited his influence. It was a quiet correction that prevented a larger scandal but sent a clear signal. For many on the base, it was a relief. For others it was a cautionary tale about pride. By the time normal operations resumed, the tone had shifted. Meetings were more transparent, and people who had once been silent began to speak up in structured ways. Riley's team continued their work, now with clearer protocols and an unspoken sense of responsibility. The victory wasn't dramatic, no parades, no speeches, but change had happened. The base operated more carefully, and that mattered because lives depended on rhythm and reliability. Riley walked the corridors again, this time noticing small changes. A clerk who used to avoid eye contact now volunteered details in meetings. A mid-level officer asked for protocol clarification instead of guessing. Those quiet adjustments signaled a deeper repair. Even as things settled, Riley kept a folder open on her desk labeled Lessons. It had more than an archive. It had reminders: document everything, protect witnesses, and build systems so truth can't be smoothed away by rank. She knew vigilance couldn't end with one victory. Reform required maintenance. That settled into her routine like another checklist item: necessary work, not grand heroics. The formal actions had corrected a wrong and opened a path for change, but the lasting work was in the mundane: processes, habits, and the slow rebuilding of trust, and over the following months that slow work became the real measure of what had been won. Meetings no longer closed with casual assumptions, they ended with checklists and named follow-ups. Riley kept her lessons folder active, not as a trophy but as a manual: entries added in real time, small amendments after every misstep, notes about who to call when something looked off. She started each morning by scanning recent edits and cross-referencing them against the protected logs Miguel had helped set up. It was tedious, repetitive, and finally, effective. People noticed that honest paperwork made operations smoother and that transparency actually reduced chaotic firefights over last-minute fixes. Some officers adapted quickly. The junior NCOs who had once obeyed without question now asked for clarifications in meetings, citing specific items in the protocol. Mid-level commanders began scheduling regular verification reviews rather than waiting for crises. Aaron took a role in training new clerks on how to maintain clear server records. Sophia helped design small, mandatory drills where teams verified a sample of logs against physical checklists. Those drills were awkward at first. Folks grumbled about extra work, but when a scheduling conflict cropped up on a training exercise, the new process caught the error before anyone left base. That quiet success did more to reinforce the reforms than any speech could. Rourke's reassignment settled into administrative record like a stain that couldn't be wiped clean. He moved to a desk job away from operational oversight, still wearing rank but stripped of the levers he had used. There was no theatrical fall from grace, no public shaming. The institution preferred to contain rather than expose. That decision left mixed feelings across the base. Some wanted harsher consequences, others thought the case a caution enough. Riley didn't spend time on satisfaction or retribution. She measured outcomes by changes in behavior, whether a newly implemented cross-check was being followed, whether junior officers felt safe to flag issues, whether the logistics pipeline ran with fewer surprises. Those metrics became her new scoreboard. Admiral Hawthorne checked in periodically, not to praise but to review progress. She asked hard questions about compliance rates, about whether witnesses still felt protected, about the speed of corrective actions. Her involvement kept momentum from slipping back into the old normal. When discussions turned to policy, she pushed for modest but enforceable language, requirements that could be audited without adding bureaucracy for its own sake. The Admiral's approach was practical: make the correct behavior the easiest behavior, and people will choose it because it reduces friction, not because they were afraid. Riley found herself mentoring in a way she hadn't anticipated. She led sessions where she walked teams through the timeline of the case, highlighting the small decisions that had escalated and the specific steps that had locked evidence in place. She emphasized how the job was not about heroics but about discipline: notice, document, secure, and escalate appropriately. Her tone in those rooms was matter-of-fact. She had no appetite for dramatics. She wanted systems that never again relied on the courage of a single person to prevent harm. Outside work, life felt a little less cramped. Riley began carving evenings that didn't involve paperwork, short runs around the perimeter of the base, coffee with Miguel where they spoke of naval history rather than quandaries, an occasional movie night with Aaron and Sophia. Those ordinary rhythms were part of the repair too. They rebuilt relationships frayed by stress. The team learned how to disagree professionally and how to cover one another's blind spots. That kind of trust showed up in the simplest ways: a correction made without blame, a question asked openly, a report filed on time. Years later, the Sentinel base included the case study in its training modules. New officers watched a recorded briefing where the core facts were laid out without theatricality: errors, manipulation, documentation, intervention, and repair. The lesson was practical and short: systems matter more than personalities when lives are on the line. Riley's role was not framed as a singular triumph but as one thread in a larger weave of accountability. She kept her name out of the headline used in training. The point was not who won but how the base learned to operate with integrity. There were still bad days, occasional lapses, human errors, the slow recurrence of old habits in pockets where enforcement slipped. But the default now leaned toward verification instead of assumption, and that made future mistakes less costly. Riley continued to walk the corridors with her folder, not because she feared another attack but because she had accepted stewardship of the quiet, routine work that keeps organizations honest. In that stewardship, she found a steady, unglamorous purpose: to make sure the next person who noticed a problem wouldn't have to fight alone to be heard.